Well, good morning. Welcome to today's edition of the Science of Successful Living. I am Asar. I am the facilitator of this conversation each and every Sunday from 9 a.m. Central Standard Time to approximately 9:45. So if you're joining me this morning, go ahead and isolate yourself, cut off any distractors that you may have. If you can't fully engage in this morning's conversation, perhaps you can just continue to do that which is most important to you, and you can just come back to the replay, which will be put out on the website a little later today. So the Science of Successful Living, we are here every week, and the goal of these brief topics is to present to you something that you can take on to master this thing called life. It's a combination of Black psychology and the best of positive psychology, along with the what I would say liberating ancient wisdom as it pertains to our spiritual evolving. So this morning we are dealing with the topic of Christianity's role in the misorientation of people of African descent. Yes, you heard it right. Christianity's role in the misorientation of people of African descent. And so we're going to drill down into that this morning. And I hope you walk away enlightened. I hope you walk away challenged. Hope you walk away with a level of cognitive dissonance, because that is the first sign of evolving, of change. Now, some of the things that I may say may offend some, but I'm not presenting to offend. I'm not presenting to shift your belief system. I believe that you have come to this intersection, and at this intersection is purposeful. And so I will present that which I believe that is that what you need to hear at this present moment in your life here. So we need to talk about the elephant that's in the room. As people of African descent, we've been in such a survival mode and can't fully understand why we haven't yet to experience full liberation as we've marched. I just so happen to grow up in that golden age. There was no age in the history like that of the 60s. So I'm a 60s child. I came of age in 72, right at the in the midst of what I would call a golden age. The music was good. Our communities were thriving. The massive amount of people were matriculating through schools of higher learning. We were getting good jobs. The brothers was returning from Vietnam. And so we had a vibrant community. But then there's something that shifted. We had the advent of the crack epidemic. We had the advent of the over-identifying or the acculturation process that was taking place. One of the things that we must be clear on when we look at the 60s and the 40s, 50s, and the 60s, the movement of liberation wasn't about acculturation, but in order to maintain the level of control and to maintain the influence that Western society had on us, Western society promoted the acculturation, and we're going to talk about that and how the acculturation that we have undergone has been to our demise and not necessarily to our betterment. I believe that a better understanding of how our attempt to acculturate into Western society as a survival strategy has had and continue to have negative repercussions. And we want to begin to address those. We, in essence, become whites and black skins on varying levels. Now, some people may say, no, I'm not a white man in a black skin, but on various levels, all of us have, let me put it another way, most of us have a level of acculturation into the dominant society or Western worldview, which is not to our betterment. We take on the worldview of a dominant, oppressive culture that at its core didn't represent our highest and greatest good. And just when you understand how the Western culture evolved, then you have a better understanding of how its worldview is so drastically different than those of us who are descendants of the continent of Africa. We must understand and first embrace the fact that there's no such thing as race. There's one race, the human race. The initial human race manifested itself over 300,000 years ago on the continent of Africa. And there's proof, and I'm not going to go into that. And so at the core of the common denomination is the mother of all mankind is an African woman. And if your mother is an African, you are an African. So what we see here that over the course of time, with the migration patterns of Africa, we moved out of Central Africa, we moved north, west, south, east, and as a result of that, the environments had an impact on us. Over now, remember we're over 300,000 years old as a humankind, and within that time span, and they say science say within 10,000 years ago is when you begin to see the differentiations, the variations of other cultures showing up, like whites or Arabs and or different phenotypes change. So we want to look at the manifestation of cultural misorientation in this conversation this morning, and it's going to go down to the fact of that cultural misorientation is supported by our belief system or our religion that many of us hold on to. Not just Christianity, it could be Islam, it could be those who are Hebrew Israelites. So stay with me this morning and try to track with me. At my core, I have studied the discipline of psychology. I have a master's in counseling psychology, and not just in traditional psychology, but my forte is Black psychology. So everything that I do, I filter it through myself, because psychology is the study of the soul, the saku, the psyche. It's not the study of behavior. In Western dominant society, psychology is looked at as the study of behavior and the shifting of behavior and bringing people into alignment with the dominant behavior, which we'll call a sense of normalcy. But when we look at the manifestation of cultural misorientation, so that we all can see that we have been impacted at some level, we see that the celebration of European or Western rituals and holidays, such as President's Day, Columbus Day, and 4th of July, among people of African descent, are seen as demonstrations of cultural misorientation. When we truly embrace these holidays, these special days, and we celebrate them as if we are part of them, then what we see is there's a cultural misorientation going on. Now, I'm not saying that cultural misorientation at its core is bad, but we're going to look at when it hits certain degrees, it in itself doesn't represent your highest and greatest good. Cultural misorientation is grounded in the idea that when African people accept Western historical experiences as their own, they assume the personality of the Europeans by over-identifying with the European culture, while ignoring, denigrating, and rejecting their own ancestors, rejecting their own selves. Well, I can look at even our professionals. We have Black psychologists, we have Black psychiatrists, we have Black theologians, but they don't have a Black theology or Black psychology, Black social workers. They have never taken a course that drills down into the essence of the Black experience. And so everybody is evaluating us through the template of the dominant society. And that is one of the reasons we get so many diagnoses that, again, don't represent our highest and greatest good. Some of the most prominent and widespread examples of cultural misorientation are witnessed in people of African descent. And let me share with you some, such as our hair preparation, our skin color preferences, and the degrading of physical features associated with people of African descent, such as broad noses, broad lips, and kinky hair. I know those last three, having a broad nose, having broad lips, and having kinky hair as a kid, that kind of impacted me. There was a time in my life when I was a kid, I remember in the 70s, using Ambi to attempt to lighten your skin, or getting your hair fried and dyed. All these things to acclimate. We may say it was a cultural thing. No, it was the cultural attempt to identify with the someone other than ourselves. The politics of black hair is a major manifestation of cultural misorientation in the black community. We can see people say they got good hair. What is good hair? Everything that is a variation, or the farther you are away from kinky hair, you had good hair. So we look at African hair practices in the diaspora include perming, straightening of the hair, weaves, extensions, all these things. Now, am I saying that those things, if you're doing any of those things, that you have a degree of cultural misorientation? In many cases you do, but the magnitude of that doesn't, I'm not going to say that you have it to the magnitude that you have some things you really need to work on. But you need to ask yourself, when I'm changing my physical self, am I at the core of my changing my physical self? Is it to look like something other than I am, or is it to say that I'm really not happy with who I am, what I am, and how I manifest? Now, many people are very uncomfortable with addressing that. Even in the clinical setting, I find that when you drill into that question, people have a difficult time unpacking that, accepting that these manifestations tell me that I have a level of alien self disorder, or I have a level of not really embracing who I am. And I see it today as you look at our dominant society, or we look at the culture today. You see that people are always trying to express other than themselves. So let's look at a couple of definitions. So as we go through this morning's teaching, you will be able to better track with me, and you can get, we are operating from the same position. So the first definition, there's three definitions I want to talk to you about. I want to talk about cultural misorientation. I want to define African or Black psychology. I want to look at this term called acculturation. Then we're going to jump right into the influence of Western Christianity on the African identity. So when we look at cultural misorientation, the concept of cultural misorientation analyzes the degree to which attributes associated with the European worldview, such as valuing the survival of the fittest and materialism, over what you will call more of an African orientation, which is collectivism. We are one, spiritualism. So we have to understand, even when we look at these concepts that we espouse in New Thought or in the more progressive presentations of Christianity, they talk about the oneness of being. The oneness of being is an African worldview, one with everything. It's the European or the Western world is a Johnny come lately. They have come into this conversation and begin to use these terms, but at the very core of who they are, they find that they are still influenced by their Western orientation. When we look at the wars that are taking place around the world, if we would really felt as though we are all one, then we will be moving towards solutions that would cease from the destruction of people who are different than ourselves. We'll understand the oneness of being, that all desire to have life. So cultural misorientation is basically when you misorientation is when you over identify with the dominant culture, or a culture that is foreign to you. When we look at African or Black psychology, it's a system of knowledge concerning the nature of reality from the perspective of an African worldview. When we look at this, there's an individual by the name of Dr. Kobe Cambone, who has since passed. His reason behind this term of Black psychology is that the African or Black psychology derives from African cultural traditions, which are informed by an African worldview. So basically, when we talk about African psychology or the study of the Saku, the spirit, so it's also, so there's a thin line between African psychology and African spirituality. So if our psychologists and our clergy or theologians will begin to talk together and will begin to reframe their disciplines from an African-centered perspective, that represents our highest and greatest good. Because when you look at the traditional psychology from the Western orientation, it's oriented towards them. Normalcy is based on them. Anything that is outside the normalcy of that group is called, that says that somebody has a disorder. The third word that I want to introduce to some is the word acculturation. Acculturation is a cultural modification of an individual, a group, or people by adapting to or borrowing traits from another culture. Now, is that bad? No, it's not bad. It makes for a great bouquet if it is done equally, if it's an exchange back and forth, if it's not one culture imposing their culture on another as if it's the culture to be expressed. So we got to be careful with that. So cultural modification again, um, of it, it's the acculturation is the modification of individuals or groups or people by adapting to or borrowing traits from another culture. The acculturation of immigrants to American life is an example. Also, merging of cultures as a result of prolonged contact. When we study the Bible and we hear the story of the Hebrews having spent 400 years in Egypt. Now, notice it wasn't a, a large number of Hebrews that went into Egypt. It was 70. It was Joseph and his family. It was 70. So, 400 years of being in Egypt, and Kemet was friendly towards them. They went there because they were told to go there. That was the place they would go to, and they were to acculturate, they were to acclimate, to blend in. Now, am I saying that if this group of people came, that they didn't have anything to offer? But for the most part, they were going to an advanced civilization. For what we know about the Hebrew, they were a nomadic group of people. So now they've come into this civilization that has been around for thousands of years, and they integrate into it. They acculturated into it, and so we got to understand that acculturation, their acculturation wasn't forced, But even though when you get to the end of that story about the last 40 years of that sojourn in Kemet, they say that there arose a pharaoh that wasn't friendly towards them. Now, let's pull that into history. You have to go back to 300 BC, around three. Now I'm approximating these dates, and 300 BC is when you see the descent of the indigenous Africans in Kemet, and now you see the infiltration of the Western cultures coming into, although they have always been coming back and forth, but now they were impacting the leadership. And you from 300 BC on up until the what we would label as the birth of Christ, um, over up until 325. So about 600 years, you went from 300 BC to 325 AD, and that's when we get the formation of what we call Western Christianity. Now, that's a good lead into the topic this morning. But before I say that, I want you to know that acculturation can be overt or it can be covert. Overt oftentimes is forced on us. A covert acculturation of the people is, to example, you set up schools of learning, and your educational process, your world history is based on European history. When you look at the religious institutions, we find that it doesn't make space for anything, or it has interpreted documents from the Western worldview. Even though when you begin to study the the origins of these major religions, you'll find that they had an encounter with ancient African wisdom, and that they took that and took it back to their cultures, and they reworked it and made it their own. So that's what I'm saying, that we as an African people of African descent must we must do. We must deconstruct the things we have, and we must say, does this what I have represents or serve my highest and greatest good? We must find the adulterants. So Christianity as a whole, Christianity is not a white man's religion. Christianity is a presentation of ancient African spiritual system from the European worldview. And that started in 325 AD. Now, so we want to look at this morning the influence of Western Christianity on the African identity. We know that the spread of Christianity across Africa brought with it a set of religious images. Now, let me say this. When I'm talking about the spread of Christianity, I'm talking about the westernized Christianity, because pre-Christianity, there was a spiritual system that wasn't called Christianity that was adopted by the cultures that came in, studied in our schools of higher learning, met with our priests, and so they took what they had gotten and plagiarized it and made it their own. So the spread of Christianity, when we look at it across Africa, brought with it a set of religious images and narratives that was deeply rooted in European traditions. Now we see if they're talking about Jesus, Jesus is the story of Asar. Asar was the first resurrected spiritual type. The Europeans took that story, 325 AD, reworked the story, gave us this character called Jesus, and then they made it their own, painted it white, and presented it to the world as this is the truth. Now, this transplantation of faith has over generations led Africans on the continent in the diaspora to embrace a form of Christianity that is often misaligned with the spiritual philosophies and ancestral wisdoms from which it was based. So our own heritage has been wiped out of it. The result is a cultural misorientation where the spiritual practices taught in traditional Christianity do not fully represent or serve the highest good of Africans and people in the African diaspora. When we look at, there are several fundamental ideologies or assumptions that undergird the construct of cultural misorientation paradigm. When we look at this concept of the cultural misorientation paradigm, which was created by Dr. Kobe Cambone, it tells us, one, there are some things that he states here. He says all people of African descent suffer from some degree of cultural misorientation. So each and every one of us here in America and the Africans who are on the continent itself suffer a degree of cultural misorientation. Example of that is when you go to the continent of Africa, you'll find that the Africans in West Africa are speaking French, or the certain parts of Africa they're speaking Dutch, because the language that was imposed on them became their language. It displaced, and it's even got to the place where we will see a foreign language as an exotic language as the preferred language than our own language. In America, most of us as Africans in America, we lost our original language. We didn't lose it. We were forced to let it go. We could not speak it. We were. If you listen to the narratives, it says that the slaves who spoke the same languages they were actually separated, so they couldn't communicate. And ultimately, we learned how to communicate with the dominant language, which was English. Another point he makes is cultural misorientation expresses itself in various ways among everyday actions of African people. It's so ingrained in us that we don't even realize that we have acculturated, we are misoriented, we are oriented toward a Western worldview versus being oriented towards the African worldview. And if you mention it, many times the acculturation process is so ingrained, or there's a cultural misorientation at a really deep level, that we don't even want to fathom the fact that some don't, that they are from Africa. It just appalls me when I hear a person of African descent who can be blue black, but because they've been in America for so long, will say, "Oh, I'm not from." A lot of that has to do with what Black psychologists call alien self disorder, who don't like themselves. Another point he makes is almost all behaviors defined in the mental disorder by the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's the DSM, are diagnosed in African people who have their origins in internalization of European worldview, meaning they're diagnosing us based on our acclimating to European worldview. Now, sometimes there are some things that are you may have a traumatic brain injury or something like that. Then that's the external event that they are evaluating you against. But for the most part, when Africans in America are assessed, they're assessed by tools that were designed within the worldview of, in most cases, the oppressor. Another point he makes in this whole conversation of cultural misorientation, he says that cultural misorientation is obtained through the cultural imposition of the European worldview through institutions such as education, religion, and the media. We can see that. We can see that those institutions control the conversation. We're going to look at that. He also says cultural misorientation counters mainstream Eurocentric approaches to mental health by presenting a reconceptualization of African mental disorders from an African-centered perspective. So he says one of the solutions is that we must, or our Black psychologists must come up, and psychiatrists must come up with diagnostic tools that are evaluating us from our worldview. So there's some of the things he pulls up. And the last thing he stated that who am I talking about? I'm talking about Dr. Kobe Kambone, and he wrote a book called Cultural Misorientation. It's a very scholarly work. Some people will find difficult time working through it. But for those who are in the field of psychology, you're in the field of human behavior, I really recommend it if you're working with Black people. He says that cultural misorientation can be combated through the building of institutions that encourage and employ an African-centered practice. Now, we see that there's a push right now to get rid of Black studies, although I saw a recent article in one of the papers here in St. Louis that the school systems are looking to promote Black studies, which is excellent. We have Black studies at the academia level, like SLU here in St. Louis. St. Louis University has a Black Studies department that is excellent. It's chaired by a great staff. And so, but what happens when they graduate? Where do they go to? So it's good to hear that those who graduate with degrees in Black Studies, Africana Studies, can now go back to the lower grades and maybe becoming faculty or even in the community, just helping us to move away from a strong acculturated paradigm of Western thinking to begin to re-embrace, where to be reminded, to be remembered, like a star, to be put back together by going back, Sankofa, going back. Now, I've been talking about acculturation. I've been talking about levels of misorientation. Somebody says cultural misorientation has turned many into converts of Western ideology that was founded in ancient African philosophy and psychology. That is 100% true, spot on. That's correct, Hasefi. So we need to begin to accept that. So when we look at levels of a cultural misorientation, in the model that Dr. Cambone has put forth, called the cultural misorientation paradigm, there are 3 levels or degrees of cultural misorientation. Now, I'm just going to put them out there, and maybe you can look at them and assess to what level that you may be inside of. The minimum level of cultural misorientation reflects some aspects of a Eurocentric worldview orientation. Although it is too weak to dominate the personality, at the same time, there's a strong African self-consciousness as manifested in many authentic expressions of African worldview. Okay, I would say I have a minimum level of cultural misorientation, but you can tell that I have acclimated or acculturated, because I like high fashion, and even though I wear garments that are culturally in interpretation, but also like a nice um, Italian cut suit, or so I that's not to say that anything that is outside of our culture is bad. But if you find those things in other cultures that you want to integrate into your life, make sure you're integrating them in a healthy way, not saying theirs better than ours. Because have found some great African garments that I say that make overshadow some of the stuff that the coming out of Europe. So a minimum level. So at the least, all of us have a minimum level of cultural misorientation. Then the next level is moderate cultural misorientation. It refers to a psychological orientation in Africans that reflect many internalized Eurocentric cultural values, beliefs, and attitudes and behaviors, while at the same time manifesting some pro-Black and African-centered culture values. Now, that's a large number of people that I run into in the cultural community are moderate. They have a moderate cultural misorientation, as evidenced by they have strong attitudes and behaviors that are pro-Black and African-centered cultural values, but at the same time, they do have some internalized. Example, if you are a traditional Western Christian and you are conscious, you have a moderate level of cultural misorientation, because if you are seeing the expression of Western Christianity and has totally embraced it and have no problem with it, then there's a level of psychological orientation that has taken place and has impacted you. So you have what I would call a moderate cultural misorientation. And when you look at the vast majority of our pastors, our theologians, they have what I call, what Kobe Kambon calls, moderate cultural misorientation. Even though they may have started what they call Black theology, but yet at the same time, all they've done is change the colors of Jesus and kept the same stories, but won't go back to the next, to where it began. So that's because there is a moderate level of cultural misorientation. Now, the one that concerns me most is this third level, which is called the severe cultural misorientation. It refers to the psychological orientation in an African or a person of African descent, which very few, if any, they have any pro-Black or African-centered values are evident in their lives. They don't celebrate Kwanzaa. They have an aversion to anything that is Black or anything that is African-centered. Um, and this is by far the greatest number of their beliefs being Eurocentric. So that's a lot of us, a lot of Africans, a lot of our leaders are suffering from severe cultural misorientation. And these are the people we put in place to represent the Black community. Um, these are the people when the oppressor's problem when the oppressor has a problem, it becomes their problem. If the oppressor has a cold, they have a cold. You know what I'm saying? And so just like when you look at what's happening in the Gaza Strip, when you have African people over identifying with Israel, over identifying with the Palestinians, and never identify with the issues that are happening on the continent, never identifying with the passion, with the issues that are happening in our own community. Now, that's not to say that we don't have a level of compassion and care. They're not saying that. Like we had Corey Bush. She represents the political representative at the state level. She made a comment, and that basically she got lambasted for it because she made a comment to the perspective of everybody's problem is not our problem. we can have a level of concern and compassion for people, but if we don't have to take on everybody's problem. But with severe cultural misorientation, when the oppressor has a problem, it becomes our problem. Okay, so manifestation of cultural misorientation are transmitted in a variety of ways. The two of the most powerful is our education, and if you want to know more about the cultural misorientation as it pertains to education, I encourage you to read The Miseducation of the African. That's by Carter G. Woodson. Every educator should read that. Every individual who is in human personal development, working with people of African descent, should read The Miseducation of the Negro. That is important. Now, when we talk about the other thing, is religion. These are the two predominant ways that we are impacted or that we are sustained in a level of cultural misorientation. I'm going to focus, for sake of time, on religion. According to the cultural misorientation paradigm, such misorientation takes place in the religious domain when the following takes place. People of African descent accept and internalize religions or expressions of religions that counter and contradict the indigenous traditional African religions. Example, we have a hard time taking on Kemetic spirituality, even though Christianity evolved from that. We won't take it back to the next step because we run into what is known as cognitive dissonance. And a lot of the cognitive dissonance cannot be dealt with until we assess for our level of cultural misorientation. According to the cultural misorientation paradigm, the images and worldviews expressed in Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are conceptually consistent and culturally compatible with the Western worldview, with the European worldview. Look at the pictures, okay? Look at the language it's presented in. It's not presented in the language or represent the the phenotype of the people from which these religions have sprung forth from. Another thing, within the Christian religion, cultural misorientation comes to the surface through the images of God. If you type in, or most of us, when we think of God, we think of, first of all, God as a male. But in the Kemetic or ancient wisdom, God does not have a phenotype, but God is represented by energy. God is represented by various things of nature, aspects of God, but those things weren't God. So within the Christian religion, we have cultural misorientation coming to the surface because we see God depicted as a man. We see Jesus depicted as a white male, blue-eyed, blonde hair. And then we go so far that you have Africans who have a level of cultural, now they move from severe and they go down to a moderate level by presenting Jesus in the churches as black. So all you've done is change the color of Jesus, but the concept, the worldview, is still steeped in the 325 AD Council of Nicaea, when they came up with the church creed and what it all represents. Angels, most times when you see angels, they are presented as white, or saints, they are white. So the Western tradition popularizes and promotes a white image of the divine. And a lot of that is also steeped in white, what I call white supremacy. And so the white supremacy goes beyond just a hoodie and two eyes cut out. But white supremacy says that Western culture is supreme, or is the high culture that needs to be imposed on, but we don't even need to impose it on them, because those we're imposing it on could never rise to the full acculturation and acceptance of what this is all about, not realizing that's what we can say about Western culture. Western culture came into the various parts of Africa, took on the concepts, and then took them back, and then they were bastardized. They were adulterated because they didn't fully understand them. So, what is the solution? The concept of cultural misorientation posits that African religion and spirituality must be aligned and congruent with the African worldview. So I'm saying we must deconstruct whatever your belief system is, if it's Christianity, if it's Catholicism, if it's Judaism, if it's Islam, it must be deconstructed to represent your highest and greatest good. Now, not deconstructed and then create falsities, but we look at example. Minister Farrakhan has done a great job. Not just Minister Farrakhan, but Faraz Muhammad, those who started the Nation of Islam, they took traditional Islam back to where it came from and presented it to the black man and has empowered. Look, when you look at, I have not seen as many healthy black men in any religious orientation as I see in the Nation of Islam. I know quite a number of brothers in the Nation of Islam. They're very balanced, very healthy. Even though I don't over-identify with the theology, I can see how the theology has impacted them because it embraces them. Christianity is deplete of African men. When you go to the traditional African or the traditional Christian church in the black community, you will not find a large number of black males. And then when you do find large numbers of black males, they're usually on the slope of life, meaning they are now 60, 70, and then they're here because they have this narrative running in their head. I'm about to get up out of here, so I want to get some insurance. So I'm going to accept Jesus Christ as my personal savior. I'm going to live according to the Bible, but for most of their lives, that wasn't their conversation. But for black people, people of African descent, the impact of Christianity is it has us accepting this as a viable way to get back to heaven, to have fire insurance so we don't die and go to hell, instead of understanding that a spiritual system should empower you to get the most out of this thing called life. Now, another thing, a solution is just changing the images isn't the solution. I go to some churches and they still have a black Jesus up there, but they still are promoting that the Western culture is better than the African culture. When the images of the divine are culturally modified to represent people of African descent, cultural misorientation still remains if you haven't got at the root of the philosophy. The cultural misorientation theory asserts that African religions move beyond the color complex and it engages the external and internal components of the religion. That is, you have a worldview orientation that supports your spiritual system, which undergirds the cultural principles, embracing the mythologies, embracing the stories, embracing the practices. That's important. Another solution when we look at black psychology. So I'm saying we need to start looking at black psychology. If anyone is listening to this, if you need to see a mental health professional, start inquiring. Is there a black psychologist, a black psychiatrist, a black social worker? Now, be careful. Just because they're black don't mean that they've taken a course or courses that support black psychology, but it's a better start. But what we need to begin to ask our mental health professionals, have you taken any courses on black psychology? Do you have any assessment tools that assess from the African worldview? Are you what are you doing that promotes the greater good of the group? And then here's another thing. When we talk about black psychology and theology, we I hope to see psychology and our theologians, our psychologists and our theologians to begin to get in the same room. Because psychology is really the study of the sakul, the spirit, okay, which is the theology. Now, here's the thing about theology. For most theologians, they're studying the history. They're not really studying the mystery of the system. And so we must begin to embrace as people of African descent to, one, know that there's a Black psychology and that there should be a Black theology. For, you may say, well, why a Black theology? Well, there's a white theology. When we look at the westernized, now, I'm not promoting that one is better than the other, but one is best for that group. Now, I believe that when you get to the truth of the matter, truth is universal. Your racism gets in the way when you cannot embrace and acknowledge the truth that you got from another people group. And that's what has happened with westernized society. They have just plundered the world, and they have taken the things of the world, remastered them, and made them their own. So I'm believing that Black psychology theology should be a specific branch of theology that incorporates the lenses of Black African understanding and experiences in the exploration of the psyche. There's no Black liberation or theology if we're not willing to deconstruct Christianity, Islam, Judaism, which will result in a different kind of cultural misorientation, or realigning, reorienting, reattaching, remembering who we are and who we come from. So I just am, my whole premise of this conversation is this. I have individuals who are waking up to truths. They wake up to the truths that what we have been given has been distorted. But because of the acculturation process, or the the level of cultural misorientation, we can't let go. And it's not the one who is shackled physically that is enslaved, but it's the one who is shackled mentally that is most enslaved. And so we have many people on the front lines advocating on the behalf of the African, the issues within the African community, but these very people are suffering themselves from a level of cultural misorientation. And so even though they're representing us because they're Black, but they are pushing a westernized agenda. They're pushing an agenda that don't represent our highest and greatest good. They're pushing the agenda of society. Like example, when we talk about one of the agendas, and I see it and I talk about it, and that is the agenda of the gay and lesbian community. Now, here's my position. I'm not gay, neither am I lesbian, or do I practice any of those alternative lifestyles. If you choose to do that, that's your choice. But it's wrong to impose your beliefs on others. It's one thing to make it the awareness of your pain points, of what needs to be addressed for your group. But then at the cost of another group, you're doing the same thing that you're saying has been done to you. I don't make those things part of my conversation. Why? Because I have an orientation that is very much African centered, before distortions, before the impact of the ma'afa, the enslavement. A lot of what we are dealing with in our community is mental health responses, survival responses. But until we're willing to get to the root, we're going to still get the same fruit. Destroy the fruit without getting to the root, it reproduces after its kind. We must get to the root of all the distortions that are impacting our community. Now, I'm concerned for all of humanity, but I believe I came this rotation of life as a Black man to be concerned about those who look like me, who have similar experiences, and then to be able to come alongside of those who don't look like me and hold the line and share my perspective, share my experience, and say my experience is just as valid, if not more valid, than your experience. There you have it. So I want you to start thinking about it. If you are unpacking this thing called Western Christianity. You come to the point of realization, you're aware that there's a lot of lies and distortions and non-truths, and you know where it comes from, but you're having a hard time, and you're dealing with this thing called what's the word we use? You have the word is, I'm gonna tip my tongue. All of a sudden, I dropped it off. The word that you have cognitive dissonance. Now, part of dealing with cognitive dissonance, you must also deal with your cultural misorientation. And you may need to get some help. You may need to find a Black psychologist. You may need to find a Black life coach who has minimal cultural misorientation. The worst thing you can do is get you a Black psychologist or a Black theologian who has severe cultural misorientation, because they don't identify with anything pro-Black or not African-centered in their values in any way. Well, that's all I have this morning. So let's do this. A couple things before I wrap up this morning. We're right at the 10 o'clock hour. Let me see if I got any comments over here in the webinar chat here. So as I prepare to go over there, first of all, I want to say, if this presentation has brought any value to you, then I would ask that you consider supporting this work, supporting me and what I do. And so you can do that by Zelle, or you can do it by Cash App. And the number is 708-368-1076. If someone would be so kind to type that into both feeds, the Zoom feed and to type it into the YouTube feed, that's 708-368-1076. So if you don't use PayPal, you don't use Cash App or Zelle, you can go to the website, oasisspiritualcenter.com. oasisspiritualcenter.com. Go over to the giving tab, and then you can open it up. And once you get to the giving tab, you can find the way that best fits how you want to transmute what you have from where you are to where I am. And I appreciate that. So before we go into the question and answer, I want to give those of you the opportunity who are sowing into this ministry an opportunity to affirm with me this. So in your hand, in your mind's eye, take that which you will allocate to this ministry. And I want you to say after me, repeat after me. In my hand, in my mind, I hold a seed. I'm sowing this seed, not because of need, neither greed. I sow because sowing prospers me. I sow in alignment with the law of circulation. And as I sow into this fertile place, this seed will take root and it will flourish, not only into the lives of those who I'm sowing it into, but it will flourish in my life. And so it is. Repeat after me. Divine love through me blesses and multiplies all that I am, all that I have, all that I give, and all that I receive. Circulate, circulate, circulate. Thank you for participating in our offertory, our virtual offertory. So a couple things. Again, I want to reiterate, Hasefi posted a comment. She says, cultural misorientation has turned many into converts of Western ideology that was founded on ancient African philosophy and psychology. This is 100% true. Many of Africans were forced to do that as a survival mode. It was expedient for me to choose, for our ancestors to choose Christianity, and before that to choose Islam, because of the 1,000 years of the atrocities that Islam presented on the African, and then the 400 years of the Christian atrocities. And it's to our advantage. Sometimes you couldn't get a job in America if you weren't Christian. If you were Jewish, you couldn't get the job. If you were Islamic, you definitely wasn't getting a job. And if you were a Hebrew Israelite, you're not getting an interview. So what we have to understand, that there's things we have done as a survival. People, Hasefio says people in the black diaspora need to take back their righteous minds. Yes, that's what it's called, remembering. So when we look at the story of even Lazarus, in the Bible, Lazarus, he was in grave clothes. He was brought back to life. It also comes from the story of Asar. Jesus is the story of Asar, the resurrection, the reminded. That's why he says, let this mind be in you. We're talking about being divine, but you cannot be divine if you cannot accept that in the form that you are, as a female, as a male, as a black, African in the diaspora. You are divine. You don't have to take on the look of someone else for your divinity. Your images that represents divinity should look like you. I have no problem with them having a westernized version of Asar. That's for them, and I don't get in that conversation. But as for me and my house, we have to come to the truth of the matter of what predated that. That's important. Tanya says, besides the miseducation of the Negro, what other books do you recommend for the layperson? So, book 1, the miseducation of the Negro. Book 2, They Came Before Columbus, Ivan Van Sertima. One that will help you understand that this continent has always been inhabited, North America, influenced by Africa. Another good book. So those are 2 good books. The third book that I would recommend is the Science of the Dr. Kayawatha Amin, Spiritual Science. Spiritual science. It says science is spirituality is science and science is spirituality. So those 3 books. So I'm going to, when I put this together and get it out, in when you look in the description section, I'm going to list recommended books. Good. All right, that's good. Thanks for putting that 3708-368-1076 there. I haven't heard the offertory plate go off, so hopefully you guys will sow into the ministry. There it is. Thank you, Tanya. Spirituality Before Religion, Dr. Hiawatha Kamene. I recommend that book. Excellent. Let me see if there's anything else over here on the YouTube side. Grand Rising, Amir, it's good to see you. Kataya 777, it's good to see you. Pure Queenly Love, it's good to see you. I don't see any of the comments, but I believe there are some comments there. So that's all I have. Now, Tuesday night, Transformation Tuesdays, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you have not participated, you ought to consider participating. The Tuesday night class is not on televised. It's not on YouTube. It's an opportunity for those of you to engage me. I do not allow people to be anonymous inside of the class. You don't necessarily have to have your camera on, but I want to know. We want to know who we're talking to, because we're sharing the intimacies of our lives, and we want to make sure those who are on this teaching are invested. Transformation Tuesday is about this. There's no information does not transform you. Information informs you. Transformation comes by way of application. Now, if you're in St. Louis, we have the opportunity to do something powerfully impacting to this community. We can create our own community. That's what St. Louis New Thought Center is about. Those of you who are out here in the Oasis Spiritual Center community, this is a great community, but there's nothing like boots on the ground. There's nothing like being able to engage, to touch someone, to feel their heartbeat, to know what's going on with people. So I'm really pushing to grow this St. Louis community. I have a place where we can meet. I have a place where we can grow. I have a place where you can go. So reach out to me if you're interested there.